Hey everybody, I'm Adam, and this is Think Club. A number of people have sent me this video and asked me to comment on it. This is Richard Wolff. He is a Marxist professor. He is challenging Jordan Peterson to a debate. He made a short video, and I am going to comment on it. I have a few clips, and I'm going to provide my analysis. So buckle up. So Professor Wolff begins with a critique of Jordan Peterson's interpretation of Marxism.
So what is it that's wrong with what Mr. Peterson has to say about Marxism? Well, it's partly that he's recycling old Cold War stuff. Mr. Peterson seems to be stuck. And he's stuck with one of the oldest kinds of arguments imaginable, telling us that we should not be interested in Marxism. In fact, it's kind of immoral, in his words, to be interested in Marxism in view of what Stalin did in Soviet Russia.
Now, Dr. Wolff goes on to dismiss the tragedies of the 20th century, claiming that you can't blame Marxist ideology for the actions of individual Marxists in the same way that you can't blame Christian ideology for the actions of individual Christians. Now, Marxism hasn't been around near as long as Christianity, so I think the track record here is relevant.
Mao was a bigger monster than Stalin, and that's impressive, because there's Hitler, there's Stalin, and there's Mao. And of the three, Mao was probably the worst. He's still revered in China. Maybe that accounts for their affinity for North Korea, which could still destroy us all, the remnants of that horrible state. Maybe 100 million people died in China during the Great Leap Forward. That's a hell of a leap forward. Well, maybe it wasn't 100 million, maybe it was only 40 million. But as I said before, when you're counting in the tens of millions, your point's already made. And then there was Cambodia and the killing fields, and Bulgaria and East Germany and Romania and the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, that's North Korea, and Vietnam and Ethiopia, Hungary, etc., etc., etc. It was never a successful communist state.
So, in addition to body count, Marxism makes very sweeping claims about human nature and our political institutions that get human nature and our political institutions completely wrong. Property rights in particular are an essential part of any modern economy, and Marxism seeks to abolish property rights. Well, Marxism makes some very credible observations about our economic and political systems. The prescription Marxism puts forward to remedy perceived problems is unthinkable. As evolutionary biologist and evergreen grievance culture survivor Brett Weinstein puts it.
What's up with Marxism is, there's a lot in Marx's critique of capitalism that's actually right. And so that kind of gets you through the door once you start looking at the analysis. And then there's the prescription, which is toxic, but it's not obvious why it's toxic. In other words, it's a pretty good story that doesn't happen to function. And so people gravitate to it because the story is moderately compelling. It's not game theoretically functional or stable or viable, and it does descend into this kind of, inevitable grave violence. And so we know that now historically. It's not just a theoretical issue. We've now seen enough of it to know that as a fact. But nonetheless, the fact that there are people telling the story to kids who don't yet know what to do with something that sounds like it might be true is very dangerous.
If you don't mind, break it down as to why it goes bad.
Well, it's sort of a tired critique, but I happen to think it's about right, which is that it just does not take account of what a human being is and what makes society function.
Modern economies are predicated on the idea of property rights. In a modern economy without property protection, there's really no incentive to achieve anything, since anything you achieve or create or build can be taken away from you without recourse. This saps the motivation of any economy, and Marxism provides no alternative to create this impetus to want to achieve. Marx's famous saying, "From each according to his ability to each according to his need," in practice turns out to be something like contribute as little as possible and take as much as you can carry. Where Marx's ultimate goal was society-wide free access to goods, capital, and services, what human nature delivered was an economic system bereft of innovation, dynamism, and personal ingenuity. Ironically, this problem of motivating each individual to maximize their personal potential is one of the glaring differences between slavery, feudalism, and capitalism. Slaves and serfs can be forced to produce, but you will never unlock the kind of economic potential available like you will when each individual is free to benefit from the fruits of their own creative endeavors. Even one's own labor can be conceptualized as a form of property right. Your labor is your property, which you are free to sell to the highest bidder. Now, this is a much healthier way to conceptualize capitalism than the Marxist critique that Professor Wolff puts forward.
You are always going to be ripped off in your job in capitalism because that's the way the system works. One of the great insights of the most profound thinkers about capitalism is that capitalism wasn't the end of slavery or feudalism. It's a changed form of them.
So Professor Wolff very much conceptualizes capitalism as another form of slavery or another form of serfdom. This is part of the oppressor-oppressed narrative that Jordan Peterson has fought so hard to dispel.
And this is the other problem with the Marxist perspective is that, and the postmodernists in particular, like they conflate power, competence, and authority. And so what Marx observed was that capital tended to accumulate in the hands of fewer and fewer people. And he said that's a flaw of the capitalist system. That's wrong. It's not a flaw of the capitalist system. It is a feature of every single system of production that we know of, no matter who set it up and how it operates.
Not only is it a feature of the system, one could argue it's a necessary component to motivate people to achieve. Without the potential of outsized gains in both social status and material wealth, what is the motivation for innovators and entrepreneurs to take the kind of outsized risks to drive our modern economy forward? It's also painfully ironic how Professor Wolff is critical of Peterson's characterization of Marxist ideology largely being fueled by hatred for the rich.
He seems to reduce Marxism, when he actually talks about it, to the problem of inequality, that some people are rich and others are poor, and he deals with that by the very sophisticated notion that poor people's anger at rich is their envy of the success.
While it seems obvious Professor Wolff is guilty of stoking the kind of hatred intellectuals like Peterson and Weinstein actively aim to condemn.
So for those of you that have already worked in your lives and wondered why, at the end of many a day, you felt somehow ripped off, it's because you were. That's why slavery is one kind of exploitation, feudalism is another, and capitalism is a third.
Peterson and others seek to replace this oppressor versus oppressed conceptualization of capitalism with the far more positive and, more importantly, motivating self-made man narrative.
If you were reasonably successful in Grand Prairie, the probability that you had inherited your money from the aristocracy was like zero, because there wasn't one, right? The whole damn town was 50 years old. So if you had any influence or wealth, you were a small businessman, small to middle-sized businessman, and you knew what you were doing. And I actually admired these people. And I thought, well, that's not very good. I admire them, and I don't share their political views. And then there's these other people with whom I hypothetically share political views, and I don't admire them at all. What's going on? And then I read Road to Whig and Peer, and I thought, oh, that's it. They don't like the poor, they just hate the rich. It's not the same thing.
Capitalism is a system premised on what Marx called exploitation.
You don't get to be a postmodernist and a Marxist. You actually technically cannot be both of those things at the same time. And the fact that most people are both of those things at the same time raises the specter of just exactly what their motivation is. And then I would say it's this resentment-driven anti-capitalism. There's reasons to criticize capitalism, obviously, but it's this underground resentment-driven anti-capitalism that I think is one of the fundamental motivators.
Now, even if we give Professor Wolff the benefit of the doubt and assume that he has nothing but the best of intentions here, I don't see how it is helpful to cast his students or any wage earner as an exploited and oppressed victim. This narrative seems tailor-made to foment resentment and stifle the kind of innovative spirit that could motivate people to better themselves. Now, throughout Professor Wolff's video, he seems to be arguing for equality of outcome, something I believe is unachievable without destroying the kind of equality of opportunity capitalism seeks to create. Professor Wolff claims,
However, Marxism exists in every country on the face of the earth. It's been going on for 150 years, and a lot more than what happened in Russia under Stalin over a period of 15 or 20 years has to be taken into account if you're going to make an assessment of Marxism.
but he's never really clear about what he means here. Is he talking about progressive taxation? Is he talking about a social safety net? Are we calling all of those institutions Marxism now? Because I believe Marxism is the idea that we abolish property rights. Now I have two more clips here. One shows, despite Professor Wolff's accusations that Peterson doesn't understand the problem, I think illustrates that Jordan Peterson very much understands the difficulties of income inequality.
As soon as you set up a domain of production, and you need to because you need things to be produced, then you instantly produce a competition, and the spoils go disproportionately to a tiny percentage of people. So then so what? Well, so the rest of the people starve, or the system becomes unstable because everybody's mad. It's like, that's a big problem. Okay, so how do human beings fix that? Well, the first thing we did was diversify the number of productive games.
This is one of the biggest advantages that first world economies have over third world economies, where they don't have a diverse set of vocations that each person can strive to achieve in. If you are stuck in an economy with few paths to success, you are forced to compete that much harder in each of those paths.
So you don't get to be NBA basketball star, but you can run a podcast. It's a completely different competitive landscape. So we can fractionate the production landscape, and then people who aren't successful in one domain might be successful in others. That's human creativity. We're really good at that. But the problem with that is you still get a positive correlation among the successful people. So because you're so successful, for example, with your podcast and your YouTube videos, your connection network is insanely powerful, right? So you still have this tendency for what's useful and good to be distributed, let's call it inequitably. So Marx pointed to a fundamental issue, but he said, well, that's a fault with capitalism. It's like, no, it isn't. It's something way more pernicious than that. And it's something like, well, when one good thing happens to you, it makes you a little more powerful and attractive. And so that fractionally increases the possibility that another good thing will happen to you. And then that spirals out of control, and you get people who have, they have all the money. And it's not because there's something oppressive about you. It's because you rode the wave of the Pareto distribution, and it threw you way the hell up into the stratosphere. And we don't know what to do about that.
So sure, we don't know how to deal with it, but lucky for us, Professor Wolff has a plan. He has a plan to deal with this problem.
What's the alternative? I already told you at the beginning of this little monologue. That's when the people who produce the surplus, the workers, are themselves the people who get the surplus. How would that work? Take any factory, take any office, take any store in America today, here in New York. Change it as follows. No more board of directors. Most things are done by corporations that are run by a board of directors. No more board of directors. Don't need it. Here's how we're going to do it. Monday to Thursday, where all the workers come to work and do what they were always doing. You cook bread, you clear the table, you set the table, you do the dishes, whatever, if it's a restaurant, say. Friday, we have a different arrangement. You come to work, half of you, and you do your regular job, and the other half of you sit around making the decisions. The menu, the investment, the redecorate, all the decisions that used to be made by the capitalist, the boss. The following week, the group of you that had meetings all day Friday last week, you do the work in the restaurant, and the other half of the workers have a meeting instead where they go over these decisions. Workers become their own board of directors. Workers become their own capitalists. Or to say the same thing another way, the worker-capitalist division dissolves.
So, out of respect for Professor Wolff, I feel compelled to admit that this is an older clip, and he may have a new idea now on how Marxism is going to save us from the ravages of capitalism. I think it's fascinating how there are a number of shows on stations like CNBC where we see that over and over again, how decision-making in business is really the most important part of business. Making the wrong decisions can destroy your business. But Professor Wolff has faith that the democratic process will yield good results, will yield the most positive business results. Now, these businesses will be competing against other businesses that do it the old-fashioned way, where they get the smartest guy to make the decisions. And I would argue that those businesses with this cooperative framework will probably be driven out of business relatively quickly by these other businesses. But I'm curious what you think. Please tell me if you think this is a viable solution to income inequality. Do you think Jordan Peterson should debate Professor Wolff? Will Jordan Peterson mop the floor with Professor Wolff? We can only hope.
Well, first of all, if you don't have a purpose, it isn't that your life becomes neutral in a meaningless sense. It's that your life becomes characterized by unbearable suffering. Because the baseline condition of life is something like unbearable suffering.